So I suppose inevitably those things rubbed off a bit.
She had a pet name.
Yes, she was called Mimi, and I mean that goes right back to when she was very young, and frankly I don't know the origins of it, but she was known as Mimi by everybody.
What about that home situation? Were there any tensions involved there?
I was brought up in a family which, in a joking sort of way, it was always said that there were certain things we never discussed at the dinner table, and one was politics, and another was religion. And although it was a joke, well, there was a bit of point to the joke. So on the whole, the general family atmosphere was we must never embarrass our father, although he was always extremely supportive about our going to church and about our going to Catholic schools. And he was a man of very high moral principles, but his own deep religious beliefs were not the kind of things that we discussed in our family, but that belonged to a certain generation rather than a particular ideology.
What about language? Your mother was French, your father was English. What language did you speak at home?
Well, we were brought up entirely bilingual because we always spoke French with our mother, and it always, even, she died in 1978, and even then it would have been totally unnatural for me to speak to her in any other language except French. But when our father was present, then we always spoke English. And it was very odd because when he was away and we were just at table with my mother, when we addressed her or she addressed us, it was always French. But brothers and sisters, we never talked French to each other.
You spoke the language of the environment.
We spoke what, yes.
Yes.
But it was an extraordinary, it never occurred to me as odd until I was much older that we just went from one language to another.
Do you think it helped you being bilingual?
I think you're bilingual up to a certain age, and after that, your own language, obviously, you get much better at that.
Yes, but I mean to say that with regard to the whole European dimension, the feeling for France, that sort of feeling you would have had now as a speaker, a native speaker, a mother tongue French, that must have been helpful.
Oh, yes. And when I went to university, I was at university in Fribourg in Switzerland, where the two main languages were German and French. It was an enormous benefit to me to be able to converse in French without any problems.
I seem to have read somewhere that you were a rugby player. Where did you play on the field?
I was a rugby player, yes. I played among the forwards. I was what in those days was called a wing forward and now is called a flanker. And then I played in the middle of the back row, which is now called a number 8. But I was in the back row of the scrum because I was on the whole too thin and light for anywhere else.
Newcastle United, a soccer team. You were an ardent follower of that?
Yes, well, I've been fairly fanatical about most games, and the local team was, of course, Newcastle United. They have their ups and downs, they have a lot of downs, but when I first began to be interested in them, that was in 1931-32, when they won the FA Cup at Wembley. That was when I started my interest, and I was then, only about 10 years old.
About that early childhood period, what were the major influences before you went up to Ampleforth?
I think it's very difficult to look back because you tend to read into your past some of the things that you think are important today. I seem to remember our being a very contented family. Looking back on it now, I'd say we were rather restricted and quite strictly brought up, I think. And then going to day school, I went as very young to a non-Catholic day school, and so I met for the first time the problems of being a minority. I found it extremely difficult when I was 7, 8, and 9 to have to come out of the religious instruction class, which the others were having, or not to be able to go to church with the others. It was at that age I first began to ask myself questions. I had a father who wasn't a Catholic. I had an aunt, one of my father's sisters, who was an Anglican nun. And then I went to the school and was treated as someone who didn't belong. So one had, even at that age, asked all sorts of questions. Well, what's all this about? And why can't I go to church with the others? And it was always put to us that we were something special, that we were different, even though we were a minority. So even at that age, one had to stand up for what one believed.
That was an era when religion was very important to people. Even here in Ireland, we talked a lot about the names Belloc, Chesterton, Evelyn Waugh even, Ronald Knox. Were those relevant in your life?
No, I think I met the world of Belloc and Chesterton and Waugh and Christopher Hollis and others. I met those when I began to go to university or got into the sixth form, and then one was told to read Chesterton. I remember I read Chesterton's Orthodoxy at one sitting, from beginning to end.
Marvellous book.
I've only read about 3 or 4 books in my life, straight through, but that was one, and I was very young when I read it. So they were all people that we were brought up on.
Yes.
And we read Belloc, and our view of history was often Belloc's view of history, which of course would be highly criticised by people today.
You went on then to Ampleforth. Why were you sent there?
I think it was chosen because I was destined for another school. I mean, that's because my mother being foreign, French, and my father not being a Catholic. And my father was at Repton, a Catholic school. They didn't know much about them. And I think one idea was that I should go to a Jesuit school. And my parents, I think, were motoring past near Ampleforth and called in, and they were very impressed by the headmaster. And that decided that I should go there. So it was as simple as that.
Because was it fairly logical thereafter that you would, when you eventually went into the seminary or the monastery in Ampleforth, that was a fairly logical progression, was it?
Well, it wasn't, in fact, because I had made up my mind to be a Dominican. And in fact, I was accepted by the provincial of the Dominicans of the English province when I was 16. I mean, not to go in at 16. But he would take me eventually. And so that was my intention. And then for reasons which I find very difficult to analyse, I think I got to know 1 or 2 monks well as I got older and appreciated the sort of people they were. And then decided, well, why not the monastery? And so that's how it happened.
At 16, you say you had a vocation, but I read somewhere that you always wanted to be a priest.
Yes, I think that's true. I mean, I think it was always there, yes. And then, but clearly, as I went along, other things emerged as possibilities. But I think deep down, that was always the serious intention.
What is it? What is a vocation?
I think it's very different for everybody, for different people. I mean, there are 2 things that are important. One is that the person just wants to do this. And there are all kinds of reasons which attract people either to the priesthood or to religious life. But I've said to many, many people, the reasons why you join a monastery are not the reasons why you stay in it, because you only discover the real reasons for being a monk once you're in it. So you may be attracted by the community, you may be attracted by the things they do, by the kind of people that they are. Those are good things to start with. But once you join, then you discover what it's all about, and you decide to stay for those reasons and not for the reasons that you entered. That's one aspect of it. And again, I've said to a lot of people, you must always distinguish in your own life between I ought to be a monk or I ought to be a priest, and I want to be a monk and I want to be a priest. Because there are people who say I ought to be because it's a good thing to do. And that's not good enough. You've got to have a wanting to do it, and I believe that wanting is something which is God-given. And then the other aspect of the vocation question is whether those who are responsible, either for the monastery or in a seminary for the formation of students, whether they think you're suitable. And very often, of course, you may want to go on, but they may judge that you're not suitable for 101 reasons. And there's nothing sadder than having to turn a person away who wants to be a monk or a diocesan priest, wants it very much, and you have to judge they're not suitable. And that is always a very hurtful moment for that person. And very often you can't give reasons, just you know that it won't work.
I understand that when you were the abbot of Ampleforth, you were very good at understanding and handling that problem.
Well, that's for other people to judge. I mean, I had to send people away, just as every abbot has to send people away. And if you have a large novitiate, you'd be a bit anxious, I think, if they all stayed. There has to be a certain process of selection, just as the same as it's always quite healthy in a seminary when somebody has the courage to leave.
Yes.
And it's very important that they should, because you don't want people staying on in the seminary for all sorts of, or in the monastery, for all sorts of reasons which have got nothing to do with what is the heart of the thing, which is total dedication to the work of God.
Did you ever feel like leaving?
Often. I found my early years extremely difficult, and I make no bones about that. But deep down, I always felt, well, this is really what I was supposed to be doing. And I've discovered, I think a lot of priests and religious, they go through a crisis period. And either you see that crisis as denoting the end of the road, as an obstacle over which you can't really get, or you see it as a way forward. And I think both in religious life and in priestly life, there will be moments of crisis, because there have got to be moments of growth. And you've got to hang on, as I always think, to that very simple truth that what our Lord said, and it comes in St. John's Gospel, you did not choose me, I chose you. And so if that rings in your ears, and other people have said, yes, they've discerned that the Lord has chosen you, then you hang on, whatever the problems.
You were elected abbot in what year?
That was in 1963.
I'm tempted to scandalise your eminence by quoting a verse of poetry at you out of Philip Larkin. It says, sexual intercourse began in 1963 between the years of the Beveridge Plan and the Beatles' first LP. Now, it was a most troublesome time, and here you were, the abbot of Ampleforth. Right. Was that an enormously difficult time?
It's far better for me to question a poet of that distinction. I wonder whether he chose 63 because it rhymed with LP.
Probably.
In fact, I would choose 61.
Round about then?
1961, I was teaching the school, I was a housemaster, and I remember distinctly in that year, something happened that made the world different. And we entered into a very difficult period in the 60s, and the high point, or the low point of the 60s, was that Paris revolution of students in 1968, May 68, I think it was. But the 60s were an extraordinary period of the emergence of all kinds of things which were new. It was a period of turmoil, and certainly I found at schoolmaster in 1961, 62, 63 quite difficult to readjust to what I felt was something new. And certainly it happened with theological students, because I was teaching theology at the time. And it's fascinating that this was happening just before the council started.
Yes.
And so the council actually came in, coincided with a period of history, because a lot of people have said that many of the problems of the church arise from the council or as a result of the council. Well, they forget what was happening just before the council. And among young people, certainly in the late 1950s, there was quite a lot of cynicism, quite a lot of sense of our society not knowing the direction it was going. That belonged to the late 50s, and it sort of exploded in the 60s. And so you've got people like John Brain writing, and sort of this hate against society. I find it very difficult now, looking back on it, to analyze it, and even to understand it. I mean, I think later historians would be able to do that. And then when we came to the 70s, we moved into quite a different period. I found it extremely difficult in the 1960s to talk to, say, university students, because they were very contentious, questioning everything. Now, I simply hadn't got the kind of mind which was good with coping with that. But in the 1970s, the mid-1970s, it became quite different. And I think it's different now, and I enjoy now going to speak to university groups, because I think they're interested in what you want to say, they're prepared to listen and the rest, without having lost their critical faculties.
You were 53 and had spent 35 years in Ampleforth when you were appointed Archbishop of Westminster. Was it a hugely traumatic experience?
I think for the first 2 or 3 years, if not more, of my being in London, I often was a kind of unreality about the whole thing. I just thought that all sorts of strange things were happening. And in any case, it all come to an end. I'll be going back to the monastery fairly soon. And then I suppose as time went on and adjustments made and one began to get into doing a job, I ceased to sort of think about those sort of things. I mean, I believe that in life one just has to get on with the next thing you're told to do.
Is it something you would ever have wanted?
I think that's a very interesting question, that, because there are two sides to everybody. I mean, there's a side of... I've often said to people, it's marvellous to be elected to something, but it's not so wonderful to have to do the job. Because the kind of being elected or appointed to something is a sort of it's a reassurance if you suddenly feel, well, I don't know whether I'm capable of this or capable of that. Suddenly you discover other people think you are. So that boosts your ego. I hope not in a wrong sort of way. But it's an entirely different thing once you're in the job and you have to carry the burden. Then you can begin to rue the day that you were asked to do it.
I'm thinking about the enormous administrative problems you must have with a huge archdiocese like Westminster, with what is it, I seem to have read 245 parishes.
Oh no, 220.
220?
Parishes, yes.
Where do they get 45? In any case, it must be an enormous, complex administrative set of problems that you daily wake up to.
I like to think that I'm quite good at delegating, and delegating the worries as well as the responsibility. And I'm helped in the diocese by 5 auxiliary bishops, and they're each responsible for an area, and they have to carry quite a big load and been responsible for each for about 40 to 45 parishes. And so really I'm spared from the day-to-day anxieties. There are other anxieties, but the burden is shared out, and that makes a lot of difference.
You're a good delegator.
I think there are some people who think I'm not. I think I am. But again, I leave that judgment to other people.
There's a word used about you, Your Eminence. It's vulnerability. I'm wondering if do you know that it's used about you?
I think I have heard it, yes. I can't remember where or how. I think it's probably true, yes. Vulnerable in the sense, I think there are things that hurt.
Yes.
But then I think there are things that hurt in everybody's life. And I rather suspect that if you can't be hurt, then, or you haven't been hurt, then you're not as sensitive as you should be to other people's hurts and other people's feelings. So I think it's a grace, I think it's a blessing. But it could be slightly uncomfortable.
So let us postulate for a moment that I'm an agnostic and a non-believer. And you speak about grace. Now tell me, what is it? What is this grace?
Well, grace is a gift which God gives you. And often gifts which he gives you are thought of as great powers and great strengths. But sometimes I think that some of his best placed gifts are weaknesses. Because there's a marvelous passage in St. Paul about God choosing the weak things of this world to confound the strong, and the things that are not to bring to naught the things that are. It comes in that first letter of his to the Corinthians. And I was yesterday in Moore Abbey, and was deeply impressed by that institution, caring for handicapped persons and epileptic persons. And that kind of institution poses the question, what is the meaning of this? Why does it happen? And again, what rings in my ears is that God chooses the weak things of this world to confound the strong. And I have to begin to realize that these people have got things that I simply haven't got. So that's what I mean by grace. It's a gift, a favor. But not all the gifts are ones that we necessarily want.
You'll be aware, Your Eminence, that the St. Paul piece occurs in Newman's essay, The Isles of the North. The weak things of this world are destined to confound the strong. And of course what he was talking about was that the two islands of Ireland and Britain would be the major civilizing influence in the Europe of his time and the time to come, perhaps indeed of the whole world. How about the position of the Irish in particular in that discussion, the Irish in Britain perhaps especially?
I can only talk really, I suppose, from my experience of the Irish people in the Diocese of Westminster. They form a very large part of the Diocese of Westminster. And it's so important for us to have the support of priests from Ireland, which we have. There is the Irish chaplaincy scheme, for which the bishops of England and Wales are extremely grateful. And also, of course, we have priests who've come over and made their home among us permanently to work with the church in Westminster. But it's a very important part of the life of the church in our country, and has been, of course, ever since the time when the Irish immigration took place in the 1840s. And I think I would like to pay tribute to the Irish people in London, because in recent history, as you can imagine, life hasn't always been easy for them, but they have comported themselves with a great dignity and great charity, which has been very, as I say, I'd like to pay tribute to that.
Were you offended by a piece of journalism I read somewhere? It said his lack of Irishness is important.
I thought that was an unfortunate statement, and I did make a little bit of a protest when that was first said. Very often, of course, if you protest too loudly and too quickly, then you make the situation worse. It's a kind of remark that one would prefer not to have been made and quickly to be forgotten. I can see how, at the time of my appointment, there was a sort of sense that we would like to have somebody with a very much an English background. I think that's what they were trying to say. So they got somebody who has a French mother and a father who is mainly Scottish. But I suppose that culturally or in education I am fairly English. So, well, that really is as much as I would say on that remark.
I believe, Your Eminence, that you have said somewhere that you would like to retire to a Benedictine monastery at the age of 65. I read also somewhere that what was needed after the heroic-sized figure of John Paul II was a not-so-good pope. And in that context, I said, that would be the only circumstances in which you might ever look at that idea.
I don't know how to react to that question. I mean, the fact that I would ever be pope is a ludicrous suggestion.
As was the idea that you would be Cardinal and Archbishop of Westminster, perhaps.
Yes, but the higher you're likely to go, the more ludicrous it becomes, so it's even more ludicrous. I suppose if they wanted a non-entity, I might be quite a good choice, but I'm not certain that you ever want a non-entity in the Vatican.
You use the phrase the hide-and-go-seek, you know, that God plays with people at some stage. And I remember reading in Thomas Merton at some stage that when he was eventually being ordained, he lay on the ground on the altar and was convulsed with laughter at what had become of his life. Is that the kind of attitude you would hold towards becoming a pope? It is possible, you know.
Well, I mean, as I just simply don't accept that it could be possible. I mean, I know enough about other cardinals, and I know enough about myself to make it not really a point worth discussing.
Cardinal Hume, you're welcome to Ireland. We're most grateful to you for coming to talk to us on our television program. And whether as a retired Benedictine monk, which is I know what you would like to be, or as Cardinal Hume, or in that ludicrous situation as Pope. Thank you.